All right, so far we learned how to write a create table statement. So that means we know the statement how to write a SQL statements to create a table. So here is another class exercise. You have to practice them by yourself, and we're going to talk about the solution in the next class. So here we have the database schema. You can see that it's a database schema about the textbook. We have is the database schema about a library actually. So it has a book, the information about the authors of the book, publisher, book copies, library. There are different library branch. Okay, and people can borrow the people can loan the book, and there are borrower. Okay, so practice them by writing appropriate SQL detail statement to define the relation book. So book has three attribute, the primary key, and it has also one foreign key. So write another appropriate SQL detail statements to define the relation book loans. So you can see that book loans has actually three foreign key. Okay. All right. So practice them by yourself, and we'll talk about the solution in the next class. Now the last thing about create table statement. So as we specified in our relational model, that whenever there is a referential integrity constant for if a attribute is a foreign key. Okay, so referential integrity constant or foreign key that actually connects two tables. Okay, so for example, say employee has DNO. Okay, DNO is the foreign key which is referencing say D number of department table. Okay, all right. Now what happens if we delete some row from the reference table? Okay, what happens if I delete some records from the reference table? Okay, so for example, if I delete this record, okay, what happens for the tuple where it is using the same value? Okay, it is using the same value. What happens to that value? Okay, and there are multiple options we can set. Okay, we can specify restrict, cascade, set null, set default. Restrict is the default one, that means it is going to reject the operation. If I am trying to delete the department number with value 1, but we have already some referencing tables which is being used the same value. Okay, uh, in that case it is going to reject the operation which is restrict. But we have multiple other options which will allow the operation delete operation, but that will actually do multiple other operation to validate our database state. Okay, so these are the example of cascade, set null, and set default. All right, that means whenever we have a referential integrity constant, we can also specify some option for that. Okay, so if we do not specify any option, by default this will be restrict, means it is going to reject the operation. And we can specify separate operation for delete and for update. Means if we want to delete the row, what will be the option? If we want to update an attribute, okay, if we want to update the value of the attribute for the primary key, what will be the option? And we can have separate option for them. All right, so in the next slide we're going to talk about an example, and you will have the idea how to find an appropriate option. Okay, for example, here employee, we are ignoring all the definition of the attributes. Okay, we are specifying only the constraint. We have SSN primary key, so employee has super SSN which is the foreign key referencing the same table SSN attribute, and we have DNO in the employee table which is referencing the D number from department table. This is department table. Okay, Now whenever we have foreign key, we can actually specify those options. All right. So what will happen if we delete the SSN value that's being used by the foreign key, attribute? Okay. So for the delete option, we are going to first write on delete. Okay. So for example, for DNO, what I'm saying, if we delete a D number, okay, if we delete a specific D number that's being used here, okay, what happens for that row, okay, for that attribute's value? By default this is reject, but we may want to allow the delete, and then whatever happens for the referencing table. Okay, on delete I am setting set default. Okay, so what it means that I am going to set a default value for all of this value. Okay, so if I delete a department with 1, okay, D number 1, then whichever tuples is using the D number 1, they are going to be replaced with, they are going to be updated with a default value. For example, here department, all right, for example here department table can have a D number with a default value. Okay, like that, say D number integer. Okay, default, we can set a default value like that, say 3. Okay, now let's see 3 is the main department, head department. Okay, now by default, okay, by default everyone, if he is unassigned, everyone is going to be assigned to a default department. Okay, so that's what I'm saying. If we delete a D number with a value, and for that value where they are using in the referencing table, they are going to be updated with a default value. So for example here each of the 1 is going to be updated with value 3. Okay, because the D number has a default value 3. All right, now I'm setting a separate option for on update. Okay, I'm saying that on update it will be cascade. So what does it mean? That for example here I want to update the D number here. Okay, I want to update the D number 3 to 4. Okay, I want to update the D number where it's 3, I want to update that with 4. Cascade means wherever the value is 3, okay, in the referencing table, they will be updated with the value 4. That means the operation will be propagated in the referencing table. Okay, so that's how I can set the option. I can have the separate option for delete and update. Okay, and if we do not specify any option by default, that means this will be reject option. Okay, so here for super SSN on delete I am setting null. Okay, means the super SSN means actually the supervisor SSN. If we delete a SSN value, specific SSN value, but here he is being a supervisor for an employee, for that case it will be set as null. Means it will mean that for that employee he doesn't have a supervisor. Okay, but if we update, that is going to cascade the value. Okay, all right, now so another type of constraint can be specified using check. Okay, so that's also another example of domain constraint. I can have a check which is a keyword. Okay, so for example I'm thinking that in my company I can have at most say 20 department. Okay, and department number has to be greater than 0. The department number cannot be actually 0, so it has to be like 1 to 20. Okay, so I can have a constant like that, check D number greater than 0 and D number less than 21. So that will enforce us to insert a value for the department number from 1 to 20. Okay, so I can have also, like for example, some another constant using check. Say I'm saying that the salary of an employee in this company, it cannot be greater than 100k. Okay, so I can have something like that: check salary less than or equal to, okay, like that. Okay, so in that case, when we'll insert a value for a salary, it is going to check that the amount has to be less than 100k. Okay, and we can actually specify a special domain. We can create our own domain. Okay, so there also, for that also, we are going to use the create statement. Okay, create keyword to create a specific domain. For example, here I am creating a domain, create domain. Okay, so that will create a domain. Dnum, that's the name of the domain, name of constant actually, as, okay, integer check d number greater than 0 and d number less than 21. Okay, so I am saying that this constant definition is the value of the attribute. The data type of the attribute will be integer, and it will check that d number is going to be from 1 to 20. Okay, now whenever I will use in my create table, okay, when I will specify a list of the attribute, okay, I can just write d number dnum. Okay, so let me write it clearly. So d number dnum. So this dnum will be replaced with all the string here. D number dnum will be replaced. It will be same as writing d number integer check d number greater than 0 and d number less than 21. Okay, all right, so now the second part of exercise. Here actually we are going to use the same same relational database schema. Here actually the table, so each of the arc is not complete. I'm going to actually update that. Okay, so we are going to use the same relational database schema. All right, but we have to write appropriate SQL detail statement with a referential integrity constant option. Okay, we have to choose the appropriate action like reject, cascade and set null for each referential integrity constant for both deletion of a reference tuple and update of a primary key of a reference tuple. Okay, and we are going to write the appropriate SQL detail for book copies. Okay, so so here we have actually the complete schema. Okay, use the same schema here. All right, so use the same schema here to write the appropriate SQL detail statement for book copies. But here we are going to actually also choose the appropriate action, either reject, cascade or set null, and we have to specifically set the option for delete or update of the tuple in the primary key for the reference tuple. Okay,